My Govanen, and welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel, where we do hard-hitting journalism on Middle-earth related topics. And in today's hard-hitting investigative journalism interview, we're going to be discussing the topic of whether girls can like Lord of the Rings, because there are rumors, mostly started by young dwarf-sized persons in my household, that Lord of the Rings is for boys, and it's not a girl thing. So we're going to have a actual girl on the program, and we're going to interview her about her love of Lord of the Rings. And in case you don't recognize her and haven't seen her face to face before, though you might have, this is Girl Next Gondor. So for those of you who were always wondering who was behind the very uh, deceptively cute-looking avatar, uh, this is who that is. So we're going to be asking some questions about who she is, why she likes Lord of the Rings, that sort of thing. So, obviously, we have to establish the baseline first. Are you, in the words of a rather different author, a daughter of Eve?
Um, while lacking at the moment the official certification and documents that would demonstrate that, I can claim that yes, to the best of my knowledge, and the last time I checked, I am in fact a daughter of Eve.
All right. And for those of you who don't get that reference, get off my channel. Uh,
Harsh.
and second question, do you in fact like The Lord of the Rings, the book?
The book, not the Lord of the Rings, for there is of course only one Lord of the Rings, and that is Sauron. But yes, in terms of the book, I would say that my experience of it has been very enjoyable. Would recommend.
And just to establish the degree of your, to use the literal sense of the word, fanaticism uh, for the book, how much of Tolkien's Middle Earth related corpus have you actually read?
As much of it as I am aware of that exists and that I have access to. So, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, the Histories of Middle Earth series, Nature of Middle Earth, which I consider History of Middle Earth Volume 13, some of the linguistic stuff that was put out over the years in the Vineyard Tengwar and other publications on fairy stories, I would argue is important to Middle Earth. Got the monsters. I've got one of my copies of the Monsters and the Critics on my desk right now. I've got others floating around. So I think it's apart from the Children of Hurin, Fall of Gondolin, and the Beren and Luthien volumes, the Three Great Tales, which are I've handled them, I've seen them, I've reviewed them, but I find that most of what's in them, apart from the commentary, is stuff that I have read. I don't think I'm overlooking anything, but if you know differently, tell me so I can add it to my Amazon
I
cart.
don't think you mentioned Unfinished Tales.
I think I read Unfinished Tales actually before I finished The Lord of the Rings. Weird
Wow.
story. Weird story. We can get into it later.
That is a rather unorthodox way of going about that. So you have read it at least.
Oh yes.
Okay. Um, all right. So, and the next thing is we've established that you are in fact a girl who likes Lord of the Rings, uh, and the next thing is, are you one of those strange individuals who would have been known in the '90s or early thousands as a tomboy?
Only aspirationally because I find that typically tomboys have to have a degree of hand-eye coordination and athleticism that eludes me.
All right. So, other than that, would you classify yourself as a nerd or a geek?
Both, to varying degrees at different periods. Yes, very strongly nerdy and geeky.
Okay. So, as far as your nerdy and geeky tendencies go, where do they? What does that cover besides Tolkien?
So, besides Tolkien, literature in general, I was a big reader as a kid. I came to Lord of the Rings because I was a big reader. And then from there expanded out into a lot of fantasy and sci-fi literature, linguistics, language. I don't speak them, but I enjoy learning about them. Uh, yeah, classics, both classics in the sense of like works of literature that are part of the canon, and classics in the sense of like Greek and Roman civilization, ancient history. I was on Science Olympiad and Trivia Bowl. Yeah, Star Trek original series, not like encyclopedically versed in it, because how would you have time to do that when you're so busy rereading Book of Lost Tales for the third time? But
Yeah, well,
yes, nerdy and geeky interests, and especially during my blossoming years, profound social awkwardness. I think that's one of the defining features, or at least a common feature.
yeah. So as far as why you came to like Lord of the Rings, you've already mentioned several things that would obviously play into that. One of them is just your love of literature in general. One of them is your love of languages. And can you even really be a Lord of the Rings or Tolkien super fan if you don't either come to it with a love of languages or leave with a love of languages? I don't think that's possible. Um, like it just from personal experience, like I became much more interested in language after reading Tolkien than I was before. Uh, that's another story for another day. But so you've mentioned those. You've also mentioned the fact that you're just in general kind of nerdy and geeky. So which of those do you think had the biggest role in you finding the Lord of the Rings extremely attractive as a work of literature?
I think probably the literary angle of it, because when I first encountered Tolkien, so the first Tolkien book I read was The Hobbit. It went Hobbit, and then there was kind of a lull. I acquired Unfinished Tales, and then I read Lord of the Rings. If I'm recalling that correctly, it was kind of messy.
It's okay. I think I started Lord of the Rings in volume two.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, that would work. That would work pretty well, actually. Uh, I was a big reader, but I was still pretty young, 9 or 10. So I wasn't really, I was reading, books, mostly books for kids that I got at the library, and they're, maybe 250 pages, and you just churn through them, but they can be well written, but they're not necessarily intellectually challenging to the adult mind. And or not to the same degree. Um, and finding Tolkien as I was exiting that phase and moving into kind of middle school, high school, where your brain can handle more complexity. I think The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in particular are really good, just adventure narratives, fun to read. But then, unlike a lot of the other series that I had read and really enjoyed as a kid, they held up to rereading. So I think that was where, as I started to get more into literature and language and started to realize what was kind of going on under the surface level, I think that's why it stuck with me so long. That Yeah, it's been the thing that stuck around longest. It's been the thing that I've had the most experience with. And once you've done that for 5 or 10 or 15 years, it's like, well, this is a big part of your life now, whether you planned it that way or not. It kind of grew on me. Not that I disliked it at first, but it definitely grew.
So on that topic, that actually raises a question that I hadn't planned to ask. My first experience reading The Lord of the Rings, and I, like you, had read The Hobbit first, although I don't remember the exact timing. Um, just to kind of give a reference, when I said I started in volume two, when I was really young, we had a ton of books in our closet in my room. And I just one day looked at the set of The Lord of the Rings, didn't realize it was, something you were supposed to read in order, because we also had like a set of George MacDonald's fairy stories, and they're all different self contained volumes. So I was assuming that's what that was. And I started reading The Two Towers, and I was like, this doesn't make any sense. because of course, you're starting in the middle of the story. So I put it down and then eventually picked it up again, realizing, oh, you're supposed to start at the beginning. But when I actually finished reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time, I remember having this sense of, wow, like sometimes you want to immediately redo the thing that you just did because it was so amazing. But in this case, it was that combined with, I'm not ready for that yet because I'm still taking it in. What was your first experience finishing The Lord of the Rings like?
It was so I struggled so much to get through the first couple of books, and then it took me until getting to like book 3, book 4, the Two Towers basically, before I really started to click with the story, that I did have a very strong impulse to go back and start over again because I was like, now I'm gonna understand what's going on and why it's important and appreciate it. But yes, I think more than with other books that you would read and come to the end of and be like, wow, cool, and put down and reach for the next one, or, wait for the next one to come out. There was like a sense of being kind of dropped off a cliff in a good way. Like hang gliding, not like, oh no, the Silmaril burns my one remaining hand to jump off a cliff. Um, yeah, so kind of being very awestruck and sort of like knowing that you had been changed in a way that you weren't expecting, and that it's not a exclusively Tolkienian phenomenon, but it was very pronounced. There's only a handful of books I think where you get to the end and you're like, whoa.
Yeah. So you read The Lord of the Rings. You mentioned that you kind of read Unfinished Tales even before that, or at least parts of. And then did you kind of just immediately jump into, I need to find all things Tolkien, or how did you end up with the history of Middle Earth and all that?
So within, I would say, probably 8 to 12 months, I had learned about the Silmarillion. I had learned that it was mainly about elves, who were my favorite, and I had become very determined to get my hands on it. So for my next birthday, I got the Silmarillion and read that, and that was lovely and excellent. Like I said, I had already acquired a copy of Unfinished Tales through, I think, parental or grandparental confusion. They had seen it at the bookstore and was like, this is one of those books that you like, and given it to me. And I was like, I've only read The Hobbit, but thank you. And then I was, flipping through it and I was like, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. I wonder why, my abortive attempts to get through The Lord of the Rings have not included any of this stuff about Turin and the dragon. This stuff is cool. Um, I
Little
think
did you know.
Unfinished Tales kind of elides the Neonor incident, or at least it doesn't go into as much detail. So maybe that accounts for why I thought, it was going to be a good time.
There is no such thing as a good time in that story.
No. Story is the opposite. It's like if you could take the inversion of a good time, that is Turin, and even more so Hurin, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, where were we? Yeah, so Silmarillion, and then kind of through a similar process, that's why I brought it up, to how I had been tossed Unfinished Tales. Um, if people saw one of, typically it was at the secondhand bookstore, the used bookstore, and people would have these like new
Right.
condition, the Tor paperback. I think this is a new set. This is the OG Unfinished Tales, though. This is,
I have that copy.
yeah, this is the one. It's vintage. If I had kept it in better shape, I could probably sell it now and make money off of that, but get myself a new one, a pretty one. But yeah, that's through that kind of process where people would find it and be like, "Oh, here's more Tolkien stuff for you," because it's like, the kid who decides one day that they like pickles, and then every birthday and Christmas their relatives just get them themed things, regardless of whether or not the kid still enjoys pickles or even like them that much to begin with. It's like, now you're the pickle kid. So so I was kind of the Tolkien kid, but luckily I did actually like it. And um, especially I remember opening Book of Lost Tales after having read the Silmarillion and seeing all of the Valar running around with different names, and just begetting children and getting up to mischief. And I was like, wow,
It's
this
a
is like an
very different.
entirely different book.
It really is.
So
Um,
yeah, so just a steady diet of totally out of order and read in a very chaotic, haphazard fashion, but just sort of steadily over the years, incrementally increasing.
yeah. Okay, so we've kind of established pretty well your history with Tolkien. So what I want to know now is, as a female specifically, is there anything that you think that is appealing in that regard in Lord of the Rings? Because obviously, like, the connections with your typical, boyish pursuits are kind of obvious. It's an adventure story. Guys are running around with swords, killing orcs, doing things that a lot of boys would find extremely exciting. Is there anything that you think really appeals more to the feminine mind, as it were? Not to be politically incorrect, but I mean, that's the point of the discussion.
No, I think I see where you're coming from, and I've been kind of pondering that myself. I started texting and asking questions to some of my school friends who are girls who like Lord of the Rings or liked Lord of the Rings.
There are
Um,
more of you.
there are a few more of us scattered throughout the continent, and I have pulled a few of them. Because it's interesting that you say that it's kind of, the relation to boyish interests and pursuits kind of is maybe more apparent. But for me, from my experience growing up with it, I first read The Lord of the Rings all the way through. I mentioned that I had kind of taken a few running jumps at it and hit the wall that is Tom Bombadil and fallen down. The bad kind of falling off a cliff now. But finally, I was nagged into doing it and pushing through by three or four of my female friends who wanted to have a Lord of the Rings marathon sleepover with the movies.
Oh
And
wow.
they wanted to invite me, but they were like, you have to read the books first, obviously. So, so that, I mean, and then that was sort of our, one of the rituals of growing up was, hey, so and so's having a sleepover. We're marathoning the extended editions, grab your M&Ms. And so my friend group was also mostly girls who were into the Lord of the Rings. So for me, it was almost like a feminine coded interest for a while. I didn't know very many boys who were into Lord of the Rings, at least not to that extent, and the ones who did tended to be very stoic and kind of closed off about it. Like it wasn't cool to be interested in things, I guess. Um, that's one element is, I mean, I think a lot of it is your experience of your, whatever kind of social environment you happen to find yourself in when you're getting into the Lord of the Rings kind of determines whether you see it as a thing for boys or for girls or I guess neutral. Um, and then the other thing is, I will say that even Tolkien admitted that killing orcs was not a thing that would only be inherently of interest to the male mind, because we have Eowyn, and then kind of by extension Galadriel. Women also lust for power and and violence at times. Um,
It's the
so I,
human
I mean, I,
condition.
huh?
It's the human condition.
Exactly, yes. It's encouraged more maybe in boys to express that kind of thing through play and stuff. But yeah, I wasn't bothered by the fact that it was about battle and war and everything. I was like, that's pretty cool. Um, and then finally, I guess, compared to other adventure stories and epics and things, there is this, people have commented on this, there's this sort of tenderness in The Lord of the Rings. There's this sincerity and earnestness and this feeling of loss and kind of having to pick up the pieces after the big triumph. And I guess you could consider those more traditionally, stereotypically feminine uh, strengths or characteristics. Sam is a gardener. Gardening is kind of, you know, earth and growing and nurturing and all that. And um, healing is huge. All of the important characters, all the powerful characters can heal. And healing is kind of one of those, again, stereotypically feminine-ish um, qualities. So, for a war adventure story, it's one that has a lot of, I guess, emotional depth, uh, as well as the action and the deeds of heroism and chivalry and such.
Right. Well, and of course, we've talked before, about Tolkien and sexism, and we've hit specifically on that topic and I think I have in my own videos just solo about, like you've got people like Faramir and Aragorn who exhibit a lot of traits that you would probably typically classify normally as feminine, like you said, the healing, all this other stuff. Um, and yeah, it is kind of an adventure story, but it's not even really like your typical adventure story because it's not like a bunch of dudes go off to go do a fun thing because the whole point of it is like Frodo is a reluctant hero anyway and you're supposed to sympathize with him the whole time, and his relationship with Sam is very, like you mentioned, the tenderness and all that, their relationship is very emotionally deep, and that's not a thing that you typically associate with dudes.
No,
So
at least not that they would admit to in
yeah.
contemporary society.
Yeah, and I actually like how you also mentioned the fact that it wasn't really cool for guys to like things like Lord of the Rings because a lot of modern American culture, at least, I don't know how it is outside of the U.S., but at least in the U.S., the cool guy is always the jock who's probably not known for his mental prowess, but is known for being big, fast, and strong. So it's those are kind of the idols that boys look up to in high school type stuff. I was lucky in the sense that I was homeschooled, so I never had that kind of environment. So, you know, I just read books and I liked what I liked, and that's how I ended up where I am. So, that makes a lot of sense how whether you perceive Lord of the Rings as a feminine or masculine coded thing can have a lot to do with just your surrounding environment and what's considered cool in that milieu. So, I think that's a good point. Okay, so that being said, if you were going to try to um, convince somebody of your own sex that you should at least be willing to give Lord of the Rings a try, uh, how would you go about doing that? And just for reference, I don't want to get into too many details, but I have at least one son and at least one daughter, and I've been reading The Lord of the Rings out loud to my son that I'm referring to, and it was the daughter who said at one point something along the lines of, I'm not interested in that because it's for boys. Uh, how would you go about, talking to somebody like that and just kind of giving them the idea that just because you don't find it interesting now doesn't mean that it's not worth, considering at least at some point down the road? Because I mean, obviously, a lot of this can also have to do with age and when you're ready for that kind of stuff. And Lord of the Rings, let's face it, is a fairly advanced read. It's not, for 3-year olds.
No.
But just in general, how do you think you would approach that?
So I think, and this might sound facetious. I'm not trying to be. I would honestly treat it the same as if I was trying to convince anyone to read The Lord of the Rings, with the understanding that unfortunately there do exist people, both men and women, who, for whatever reason, they just don't particularly love The Lord of the Rings. Now you could argue about their taste and so forth. Um, but I would probably approach this person and say, well, what do you like? What is it that makes, what that makes this quote for boys that would make it be not interesting to you? Because it's not forbidden to you. We're all, I'm assuming that the young females in your life would probably be encouraged to read Tolkien rather than discouraged, maybe encouraged beyond what they would prefer. So I guess that would be how I start with it. I also, there are, again, without being too specific, there are children in my life and surroundings as well. And at least one older, not old, but older male child and younger female child. And they both know that I really, really like Tolkien. And they kind of view that with a sort of tolerant amusement and sometimes exasperation. But I did a little interview of my own on both of them, and the older boy said that he prefers Star Wars, but yeah, he's okay with The Lord of the Rings. His experience up till this point has been talking to me about it, or being forced to endure my tirades about it, with him sort of being a more or less captive audience. Um, but he's been watching the 77 animated Hobbit. He got caught on a long car ride and had to, that was kind of his only solace. So he watched that a couple of times and was enjoying that, kind of chuckling at some of the jokes. And he knows the memes, of course. He knows a lot of it through the memes
Yeah.
that I've explained the context of. And he said, "Well, I said, okay, so Lord of the Rings is, you consider that okay? What do you like about it, boy, child? Let me take notes here." And he said that he liked the battles, but he enjoyed the fact that there were factions that you could learn about, elves and hobbits and things. And he said, honestly, I've always had like a soft spot for like goblins, orcs, sort of the monstrous foot soldier type character. He didn't put it in that term, but the way he was describing it, he was like, I really like little like war creatures like the goblins. They're really cool. Okay. So if liking goblins is a boy thing, then that is why that particular boy was, considered Lord of the Rings to be quote cool. And then I went to the girl, who is a more interested, I would say, in literature for her, adjusted for age, than the boy, but not not Lord of the Rings. She is young. She
Yeah.
may grow into it, but she said, Lord of the Rings is dumb. I said, well, why is it dumb? I said, do you think it's for boys or do you think it's for girls? She said, no, I don't think it's for boys. I just think it's dumb. I said, what's dumb about it? She said, well, elves are dumb. I said, I'm not arguing. No argument there. Elves are dumb. Um, what do you like then? What would you consider to be cool? She said, well, Pikachu is the coolest. And again, I had no argument. Pikachu is the coolest. She said, and there's no Pikachu in the Lord of the Rings. Pikachu's only in Pokemon. So Pokemon is better than Lord of the Rings. And again,
I'm
I
getting a
could maybe
rough.
question her premises, but her chain of logic was I had nothing to say to that. So, but Pokemon is a franchise about little battle creatures, which is exactly what the boy had picked out as being the thing that made Lord of the Rings cool. So, I guess maybe I would argue to bring this Shaggy dog back home, hopefully with the Silmaril in his jaws. The If I were trying to pitch the girl on the Lord of the Rings, I might say, well, it's got little battle creatures in it. Maybe the elves are kind of like electric type Pokemon. And the orcs could be like poison type. I don't know.
Dwarves
Um,
are obviously rock type.
Obviously. Well, hold on. Let's not jump to conclusions. Yeah, they're pretty obviously rock type though. Yeah, so I guess it would be a question of finding out what the person is looking for in a book. I've tried to pitch adults in my family growing up on this, friends who were readers but who were not necessarily Lord of the Rings or fantasy fans. I'm like, it's got a love story. It's got multiple love stories. It's got like there's drama in it. It's, descriptions, and with varying degrees of success depending on whether they kind of vibed with it or not, I suppose is the best way to put it. If they could, trudge through the tree description and see sort of the underlying themes. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily break it down versus by gender, more so by what is this person going, because I think everyone get something slightly different out of the Lord of the Rings, and there's overlaps and there's generalizations you could maybe make. Maybe girls are more likely on average for a host of interacting reasons and factors to enjoy the character dynamics and relationships, and the boys and men are going to be more interested in the attention to detail in the linguistic development, or factions, keeping track of like what the maps and what group of elves lives where, and the troop movements during the battle, that kind of thing. But there's always going to be overlap, and it really, I think, boils down more to the individual than their class or other, I guess, distinguishing features.
Yeah. Well, and that, that is a great point. Obviously, as the old saying goes, there is no arguing about taste. You like what you like, you don't like what you don't like, and you can't. And that's why, you know, uh, despite what you might think, I'm not that pushy about what my kids like.
Yeah,
Um,
I understand.
oddly enough, like my son, the one that I was referring to, he tends to like what I like because I like it, and the daughter that I was referring to tends to like a lot of what her mom does or likes because it's her mom. They're
Mhm.
both very like attached in that direction. Not always, but it's a very strong tendency, and it's been kind of interesting seeing that growing up because when I was growing up as a kid, neither myself nor my brother had any real pull one way or the other just because we were that hyper attached to one or other of the parents. So that's been kind of an interesting dynamic for me to get used to. But I will say, my kids have also watched the 77 animated Hobbit, and my daughter apparently seems to enjoy the movie, and she likes singing some of the songs occasionally too. So there is hope.
So there is, and man, those 77 Hobbit soundtrack is just, it's hit after hit, honestly. It has no right being as good as it is. So
Oh, I
catchy.
know. That is one of the things about that movie that I love so much, and it's again that's another one of those things where there's no arguing about taste because some people will say the music in it is terrible, and I'm like, you have to kind of like 70s singer songwriter music a little bit, at least a little bit, to be into that soundtrack because it's so 70s. But
Man, the Goblin Town song, though, it's iconic. It transcends genre.
oh, it does. But like the
But the
Greatest
rest of it, no,
Adventure
I,
and
I agree.
yeah. But it's just it's one of those things too. I think when you get it young, before you can kind of have your tastes really defined, it might be one of the defining things about what you like
Yeah.
because I got that I got that movie when I was so young. I can't even remember how far back I've been watching that movie because I've been watching it for so long that it probably played literally a defining role in the kinds of music that I like. So the fact that she likes the songs and enjoys the movie, there's at least a launching point that you might get them there. And if she never does, no big deal.
I would say
My
too,
wife is not a huge Lord of the Rings fan. She's more of a Star Wars fan,
yeah,
and that's fine. It still works.
there's a beautiful overlap. My family's been going through the entire Star Wars film corpus, so I've been getting a lot more passive exposure to that side of things. I'm like, this is all, it's so beautifully, maybe not Lord of the Rings, but Silmarillion overlap, definitely. I would say too, with regards to kids and tastes, that's kind of part of it. Going back to earlier where we mentioned that whether or not you see the Lord of the Rings or Tolkien or anything really as being like, oh, that's a boy thing, or boys aren't into that, only girls are, or that, whatever. It depends on like specifically the environment that you're in growing up, and also going into how you define your tastes. A lot of that when you're a kid is a process of identifying with your parent slash parents and then pushing away from your parent slash parents, trying to latch on to one or both or either or, kind of alternating to the, traditionally, like as you go through the developmental stages, you're identifying with either, more so your same-sex parent or the opposite sex parent, depending on like what you need and how they're interacting with you. And again, that's kind of the academic model. Every situation is going to be different. But there's this tension between, oh, dad likes that. That must be a boy thing to like. And
Right.
I want to be just like dad, either because I'm a boy or because I don't want to be a girl. I'm not into what, the other options. So I'm gonna be into that. Or you could go the opposite route and be like, I would normally be into this thing, but that would make me too much like my dad or too much like my mom. And I want to be a different kind of person. So I'm gonna, strike out and find something else to make like my own thing. Not even in a like angsty teen, like, you don't understand me, dad, kind of way, but just even subconsciously, it's like I don't feel, that's not something I can own as part of my personality and taste because it's already kind of been claimed. So I mean, maybe a little bit off topic, but I think as we're watching, because let's face it, the argument that like, oh, that's for boys or oh, that's for girls, therefore I'm not going to engage with it. That kind of argument has the most strength when you're young. I think once you reach a certain age, you don't really care as much whether, oh, people are going to think I'm girly or, oh, people are, nice, nice girls don't like watching orcs being slaughtered or, imagining battles. Like, you got to hide that part of yourself. People are going to think you're weird. You won't get asked to prom kind of a thing. Yeah. Yeah. Once you grow up, you're sort of like, okay, I'm going to read the book that I want to read. I'm in my own space, my own room. I have a job and make my money, and I'm going to use it to buy little Funko Pop Balrogs. Gosh darn it, nobody can tell me different.
Well, and that actually brings us very neatly full circle back around because I can cite C.S. Lewis again for, and I'm going to mess up the quote a little bit, but he says, when I was a child, I read fantasy stories or fairy stories and I was embarrassed about it. And so I hid it. And when I became a man, I put away childish things and stopped being embarrassed about reading fairy stories.
Yes,
So, yeah, I mean, there is definitely a sense in which that is true. But uh, I think that's probably a good place to end this highly, highly journalistic interview about whether girls can like
your
Lord of the Rings.
your integrity is unquestionable.
And we will call it there. I hope everybody at least enjoyed the process because I think it is at least one that is worth talking about. And it was, and by the way, for the audience, this is kind of a inside joke, but not it won't be inside the joke any longer. This all got started like 18 to 20 months ago when my daughter first said this. And I mentioned it to my wife, and she was like, you could have, Girl Next Gondor on and ask her about that. And I was like, that's a good idea. And I hit her up 18 months ago, and we're like, okay, well, let's get past the holidays, and then we'll look. And then it just life.
Oh
So this
man,
is like almost 2 years in the making. So I hope everybody enjoyed it because otherwise that would be depressing.
that would be depressing. We pulled through two, not one, but two holiday seasons, and yeah, life, multiple episodes of life.
Yeah. But hopefully everybody's had a good time, and we will go ahead and end it there. And for those of you who haven't already, you've now seen Girl Next Gondor in the flesh, even if it is through a camera screen.
Mhm.
So with that, I guess we'll bring it to a close. Namarie.
Namarie.
Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kindling.